Are the remote people in here? Yes. No? Okay. Oh, that's amazing. Hi, everybody. This is great. It's so really wonderful to connect everybody and to have our group sort of spread its wings and include all the people all over the country and the world. Welcome today, and we're so lucky to have Mary Beth with us. She started the street safety movement long before we got here and paved the way for us, and she's going to give us the benefit of all of her experience and knowledge and wisdom. So thank you.
Thank you, Judith. I recently got a new hip, so you're going to see me getting on the chair, getting off, just trying to stay lubricated. Thank you for inviting me here tonight to give this talk to my fellow members of Families for Safe Streets. We're here tonight in the welcoming offices of Transportation Alternatives. As soon as I walk in the door, I feel gratitude for the many roles I've had the pleasure to play over the past 10 years. I treasure TA's intrepid leadership, the amazing staff, and the friendships I've formed with so many. This is also the home of Families for Safe Streets, just celebrating its 3rd birthday. Happy birthday, us. I hold in my heart the extraordinary members of FSS as Bodhisattva warriors, a Buddhist phrase referring to warriors of compassion. Grief, What's Activism Got to Do with It, is the title I've given to tonight's talk. I will share a perspective on what activism has indeed had to do with my emotional journey of the last 10 years. Anyone's trajectory from deep, sudden grief toward resilience is hard and crooked. Grief shifts and moves unevenly, but can be informed by choices the grief-stricken makes and the people they surround themselves with. When we no longer have what we love or want, are we able to find ways to want what we have? There are 2 characters in the Chinese language that together compose the word for crisis. One character is for danger, the other is for opportunity. In the aftermath of my husband's death, when I could read anything at all, I read poetry. I found the broken state of my mind and heart in poems like W.H. Auden's Funeral Blues. And so I'd like to begin tonight by reading one stanza. He was my north, my south, my east and west, my working week, my Sunday rest, my noon, my midnight, my talk, my song. I thought love would last forever. I was wrong. Tonight, as I speak on the subject of grief and activism, I hold in my thoughts those of you who have lost a loved one, but also our traumatized survivors of traffic crashes. The unimaginable loss sustained each year by 4,200 seriously injured New Yorkers is catastrophic. Those who have lost the capacity to use their precious bodies in the same way may have to exist within the realm of acute or chronic pain and begin the long, uneven road of rehabilitation and healing. Those injured belong to one of the more hidden horrors of unsafe streets. I have used writing as one way to raise awareness. Some of you know my story, but since some of you may not, and our stories are a significant part of what we bring to change, I'd like to read a couple of paragraphs from my essay titled Collision. Originally published in TA's Reclaim magazine in the spring issue of 2013, it appeared under the super title, What It Takes to Change a City. It was one of 2 personal stories, the other belonging to the wonderful TA senior staffer, Lindsay Ganson, about her father, our fellow FS member, Hutch Ganson. I recently had the opportunity to read a revised version of Collision at Bennington College on the 10th anniversary of my husband's death. I love the man beside me. We love the open road. Night Ride by Joni Mitchell. It could have happened cycling up mountain passes in the Canadian Rockies, navigating traffic mayhem on the streets of Athens, or biking curving wet roads through Wales. It could have happened as we rode our children to PS 87 or wheeled after them touring Holland or Ireland, but no, all went well. Even on our first date in 1971, the two of us cycling across the Mass Ave Bridge, something could have happened, but instead, 35 years later, we took our last ride together. When Henry died, grief squeezed me like a relative who hugs too tight and too long. For months, I slept an hour, maybe two, then woke for good in early morning darkness, already craving the end of the day. Medication, I used it. Meditation, I tried. Anger, it surfaced in all the wrong places. On a humid morning in August, holding a clutch of blue hydrangeas, I squinted into the sunlight and watched as Henry's commuter bike, not the one he'd ridden that night, was painted white. Ghost bikes are political. They stand where a cyclist has been killed, stark reminders that vehicles can be instruments of death. I placed the flowers in the basket that once carried his black doctor's bag, the one with the gold clasp that I'd given him at graduation. It accompanied him on home visits to his elderly patients, as well as to young men dying at home from AIDS. In the New York of the 90s, that scourge was obvious every day. What I didn't realize then was that another epidemic, that of traffic violence, also raged. Speed and the failure to yield claimed the life of a New Yorker every 36. In 2006, Henry was one of 16 cyclists hit and killed by a reckless driver in New York. That same year saw 168 pedestrians similarly mowed down and thousands injured. But like many of us, until it happened in my life, I've been blithely going about my business without awareness of this tragic loss of life in our midst. As a psychotherapist, I was always interested in context. And so around this too, I wanted to peel back the layers. What I learned was just how preventable these deaths were. Previous to these events, my activism was limited and episodic. I was active against the war, active for women's rights, for the community gardening movement, and against cars in city parks. But that was more from an aesthetic and enjoyment perspective, not really safety on our streets. How sad that my husband's death had to be my wake-up call. In 2006, the only act in town, the only people significantly addressing this particular injustice was Transportation Alternatives, already then a 32-year-old advocacy organization. Membership dues fund TA, even my membership dues. I had joined them in 1977, but I had never stepped up for the cause. Despite all my urban hiking and cycling, never. Teaming up with TA also offered me, in the midst of my personal disaster, a crucial connection, of being in community with other like-minded people when I had lost the most meaningful connection of my life. I even got to do what I love with them, ride my bike. My riding a bike had always been infused with a spacious sense of independence, discovery, and pleasure. It was sheer fun to ride a bike. Activism can be defined as efforts to promote, impede, direct social, political, economic, and/or environmental reform in the hope of making improvements in society. I began to realize that by committing to the future with this work, I began to make my present more inhabitable. Hope plays a significant role in activism. Hope is dangerous, and yet it replaces fear. To live is to accept risk and gamble on the future. Hope calls for action, and action is impossible without hope. Although initially operating on a kind of automatic pilot, the hope that was mine and would continue to propel me was housed in a belief Henry and I harbored since we'd ridden our bikes through Holland and Denmark in the early 1980s. Amsterdam and Copenhagen were intensely exciting discoveries for us. These were urban environments where pedestrians and the city's many cyclists, including numerous 80-year-olds, were treated as if their lives mattered. As vulnerable users of the street, they were protected from most dangers of sharing the road with vehicles by careful designing. After riding there, we carried home with us a dream that someday our own beloved city would become as vibrant and safe as those we had visited. After Henry's death, I had to stop dreaming and help actualize the vision of a bikeable, walkable city where streets were reclaimed from the bullying dominance and pollution of automobile traffic. But the dream was also what would take its place. But before I expand more on that, let's look at the concept of resilience. Resilience connotes a capacity to recover quickly or the ability to spring back into previous shape. But I mark whatever resilience I've achieved with an asterisk. There's been nothing quick about it, and the shape of my life, rather than restored, has changed significantly. Grief in the aftermath of traffic violence is long and hard. We all know that. But several things contributed to where I am in my life today, and activism, indeed, has from the beginning of my grief informed my progress toward well-being. It has a great to do with who I have become. In her volume of Paradise Lost, Rebecca Solnit, the historian, author of 18 books, and lifelong activist, writes about large disasters, highlighting what happened in the 1906 earthquake in San Francisco, in the aftermath of Katrina in Katrina in New Orleans, and 9/11 New York. She documents the outpouring of human compassion, the desire to help one another, and the ad hoc and generous ways residents devise to do just that. Contrary to governmental and military perspectives that communities must be saved from their worst elements unleashed in disasters, she documents the organic opposite, the rising up of our best selves. Individuals and communities become creative and organize each other. Solnit sees that what is at stake in human disasters is the question of human nature, not a fixed state or who we are ordinarily, but who we could be since we hold within us a multitude. Stepping up to activism offers us possibilities when all seems lost. It isn't reliable or fast. Every act is one of faith, using whatever wisdom and experience seems most likely to get you there. William James, considered the father of American psychology, held that beliefs shape the world. He claimed that a vision that we believe in has the capacity to propel us forward against great odds. When he was experiencing firsthand the 1906 earthquake in San Francisco, his brother, the novelist Henry James, wrote to him expressing his horror at learning of the quake and imagining his poor brother traumatized. But the way William was experiencing it from within the city, he wrote back expressing a deep feeling of community, respect, and love for the way his fellow San Franciscans were responding to their circumstances. I think many New Yorkers can relate to that same response after 9/11. We became our better selves while our government was turning to war. Recently, Rebecca Solnit's slim volume, Hope in the Dark, everybody to see, Hope in the Dark, Untold Stories, Untold Histories, Wild Possibilities. Written in 2003 in response to our going to war with Iraq, has been reissued. The stories of activism she tells remind me of our work. It has become my little Bible since our presidential election. I encourage anyone even slightly interested in activism to read it. The novelist and essayist Ed Abbey described this book as the history of the shadows where hope lies. Members of FSS know a lot about shadows. We also know something about hope and bolstering each other up when setbacks look like losses. We all need reminding that we have already ushered in significant changes by channeling grief and rage into the transformative. My need to take action in 2006 felt as crucial to me as my need for air and water. Despite my children and good friends and my practice, a deep loneliness descended upon me like I had never known. I didn't want to be more alone. I wanted to be on a team that got it, got that my loss was tragic but not inevitable. A team where if on some days, because of my grief, I needed to sit on the bench for a while, it was understood. No need to reinvent the wheel. I could learn from TA and maybe them from me. At TA, my activism took and continues to take many different forms. One form, public speaking, which I previously shunned, suddenly seemed almost natural. But what was not natural was managing the particularly steep learning curve that lay ahead. In my work in psychotherapy, I'm always reminded how slowly change can come about. As human beings, we like the familiar. My father had an expression, you can get used to hanging. But on these issues that seemed deeply moral and ethical, that of saving lives and reducing suffering, I expected a different response from people, a faster pace for change. Speaking at City Hall press conferences or lobbying individual legislators was challenging, but nothing compared to trying to influence my own community board. Community boards, the most elemental form of our city government, is where I learned how an absence of vision could operate for decades, keeping a neighborhood's killing streets. Trying to persuade its politically appointed members to understand street redesign as a rationally compassionate community choice was a deadening experience, as was trying to have a dialogue about traffic law enforcement at my police Prince liaison meetings. My great challenge was to manage my emotional response to this seeming outrage. Recalcitrance, dismissiveness, and blaming the victims were what greeted me. Those deeply frustrating nighttime meetings often left me trudging home tearful and doubting that I had the backbone for this work. But the naysayers of my community board were not the enemy, not really, even though they seemed to be. But they and we have very different beliefs. The resistance our ideas encounter was usually based in a belief in car necessity and dependence as an inevitable given of modern urban life, and street deaths as indeed accidents. The need for cheap on-street parking went hand in hand with that dependency. Antiquated street design favored the movement of cars and providing parking spots over designs that favored the vulnerable majority of pedestrians, cyclists, and transit users. This resistance was similar to that in psychotherapy. We don't move toward the new and the different if we don't have to. We don't change our own behavior unless it causes us enough anxiety. But when your whole world has been shattered, you think other people will get it if you just play axe. Solnit writes about change rarely being straightforward. It can be as complex as chaos theory, she says, and as slow as evolution. It was less than a year after Henry's death that I learned that a Swedish policy, Vision Zero, based upon engineering redesigns, had been years before adopted by the Swedish Parliament to eliminate traffic deaths. I imagined the possibility that we too would have our own. In 2014, it became a reality, and now over 10 American cities have followed our lead. But still, as far as we've come, we are still mid-revolution. Several struggles on the Upper West Side about safe street redesigns came to mean a great deal to me personally. I have lived on the Upper West Side for 45 years, sent my children to neighborhood schools, and both my practice and my husband's medical practice were there. Advocating at my community board meetings was excruciatingly frustrating. It took 4 deaths of community members and huge organizing to finally win approval for the redesign of Broadway and 96th Street intersection and all of West End Avenue. On the 2 arterials of Columbus Avenue and Amsterdam Avenues with high volume truck traffic and green lights timed for speed, we had seen crash after crash. And yet at CB7, there was a profound lack of concern for the thousands who lived, worked, or attended school on these major avenues, the majority of whom did not own cars. After 2 years battling inertia, a 1-mile bike lane for Columbus became a small measured win. It took 2 more years for an extension further north and south to make that bike lane useful to the community. Amsterdam, likewise, was stalled during a 4-year battle at community board level, but finally we succeeded. And I was so proud the night we packed the house and many FS members shared that moment when a majority of the CB7's board voted that what had always been a punishing arterial would be transformed into a more forgiving street. One day, we expect to also see select bus service come to Amsterdam Avenue. I was recently corresponding with a psychologist about a protocol for a short-term resiliency focused support group. The group was intended for those who had lost someone in traffic violence. I asked her if, in these groups, the idea of advocacy was ever discussed as one tool for addressing grief, since the circumstances that result in crashes, as we've learned, are preventable. I was asking if she thought activism could be a part of healing. Her reply, though sounding most reasonable, gave me pause. Quote, "Working for change can definitely be healing. However, those that attend our program are usually still within 6 months to 1 year of their bereavement, and more often than not, still struggling with trauma, symptoms of PTSD, and just trying to cope with day-to-day life. I do feel asking participants to take action during the course of the program can be potentially harmful, making them focus on wider issues rather than building resilience for themselves and being able to cope with their grief." Forgive my smile. I couldn't help but think about top-down ideas about grief. Sometimes they might serve us, sometimes not. I know about my own grief, and what I found so important may be true for many of you here. If I did not honor my own instincts in the early stages of my grief, if I'd let a professional like myself deem it potentially harmful for me to take my action, or if TA had discouraged my stepping up with them, fearful of my then very raw grief, I would have lost out. My own resiliency has been very much linked to the work I have done to achieve a livable city. If others like me had been similarly dissuaded, and weren't women once told to avoid activity during pregnancy? The formation in 2014 of US, the incredibly effective support of an activist community of Families for Safe Streets, would not have happened. And here's what else. Without the activism of the whole extended TA family, our city would not be winning. The vision that Henry and I shared was the collective vision of TA and FSS. And the collective activism for that vision has generated pedestrian plazas, play streets, complete streets, public bike share, select bus service, Vision Zero, new collision investigative protocols, a lowered speed limit, speed and red light cameras, hundreds of miles of bike lanes, editorials and public opinion polls supporting our work, hundreds of thousands of daily cyclists, and millions more who ride a few times each month. It has generated a culture change with new language and new ideas for urban living that has spread nationwide, and most importantly, saved lives we will never know about, and reduced the suffering of thousands of our fellow New Yorkers. This is rational compassion at its best. Believe in a dream, maintaining a vision. Grief channeled is what brought me here. Our culture change is still in what I like to call mid-revolution. We still suffer too many deaths and injuries. We still need miles and miles of more protected bike lanes, dedicated bus routes, safe routes for seniors and school children. A few cyclists still ride their bikes like jerks, and some community boards remain an uphill battle. But, we must keep in mind how we once assumed polluted rivers and air were the inevitable outcome of a modern society. Similarly, the long history of activism shows that the work gets easier as the work gets harder. We still live with the fact that children in poor, truck-trafficked neighborhoods suffer higher rates of asthma and higher rates of crash deaths. Our trauma center partners see far too many healthy, young, and old brought to their doors by ambulance, their bodies wrecked by crashes. And still, despite rhetoric, a fully funded commitment to Vision Zero lags at City Hall, and too much fear still accompanies us as we navigate our communities of home and work. Although there's nothing easy about activism, a heightened sense of well-being develops from coming together to do the work involved. A nurturing river has run through the landscape of my healing and brings a deepening satisfaction that what Henry and I once envisioned for a city is becoming street by street more of a reality. Solnit reminds us that perspective is everything, and hope in the dark is her primer on perspective. Remember, Gandhi's ideas built on Tolstoy's, and Martin Luther King's built on Gandhi's. Sometimes it doesn't happen in the course of one lifetime. If you have unreal expectations of the nature of change, you will go home. But when you believe in a vision of a life-affirming city, and you know it will take an active village, it's always too soon to go home. I'd like to finish now with where I began, with a poem. This one speaks to me of wreckage, confusion, but unseasonal and unexpected renewal. Mary Oliver's Hurricane. Hurricane. It didn't behave like anything you had ever imagined. The wind tore at the trees, the rain fell for days, slant and hard, the back of the hand to everything. I watched the trees bow and their leaves fall and crawl back into the earth as though that was that. This was one hurricane I lived through. The other one was of a different sort and lasted longer. Then I felt my own leaves giving up and falling, the back of the hand to everything. But listen now to what happened to the actual trees. Toward the end of that summer, they pushed new leaves from their stubbed limbs. It was the wrong season, yes, but they wouldn't stop. They looked like telephone poles and didn't care. And after the leaves came blossoms. For some things, there are no wrong seasons, which is what I dream of for me. Thank you so much.